two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Spencer Beswick, a fellow member of Ithaca DSA, but Spencer more or less leads the Marxist reading group. And to be honest, I'm not part of that group. I just have too many other things on my plate. I remember a regional DSA meeting, about 7 years ago. DSAers from around the state and even outside the state were discussing questions of identity. And longtime comrade Steve Max intoned, "I identify as a Marxist." My own feeling is I don't know whether or not I'm a Marxist, and I really don't care. Yeah, I see Spencer smiling at that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me on here. I really appreciate this chance to talk about these ideas that I find really useful and helpful, and that I'm excited for us to have these conversations as part of Ithaca DSA. So my own standpoint is I want to begin with a classic quote from Lenin, as long as we're talking about the Marxist tradition. He says that without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. And much as I disagree with Lenin on some things, I think that he is right there, right? That we are faced with this world with so many problems, that we live in the richest country in the history of the world, and yet children are starving, that we are destroying the planet in the interests of making profits for a few. And I think that we need to have an analysis of why this is the case. We need to have a framework in which to understand the world, why it is set up in the way that it is, why it works the way that it is. And that this kind of analysis needs to lead to a strategy that we can develop for how to change the world, and then develop the correct tactics to implement this strategy. And so I start by this because I think that it's an important reordering of some of our priorities as socialists or as activists to say, okay, we need to collectively develop these intellectual tools in order to understand the world and in order to understand our activism. So a few years ago in Ithaca DSA, soon after I joined, there were some comrades who expressed interest in learning more about Marx, learning more about Marxism, trying to understand what Marx had to offer for us to understand the world. And I think that Marxism's one of its great strengths is that it does offer a cohesive, coherent framework, a coherent critique of the world as it is, and presents a path forward to building a new world. And so we decided to organize a Marxist reading group that meets bi-weekly, that we read together relatively short bits of a variety of authors, but we started with Marx and Engels to try to understand this tradition, see what we can take from it, see what we can learn, always be talking about what is useful in it for our own work today, for our own activism, for our own search for a better way to live and a search for a strategy to build a new world, and then also to abandon the parts of it that we don't find useful. But that this needs to be a living conversation that can inform our activism as a chapter and can inform our own political work in Ithaca.
So you started by reading the classics, but maybe you could get a little more specific. Which ones?
The first unit was an introduction to Marxism, and we did it through going back to Marx and Engels, right? So we actually did start by reading the Communist Manifesto. There's a reason why it is one of the most widely read and widely distributed texts in the past 150 years, because in it Marx lays out his basic analysis of how history works, how capitalism works, why the world is organized how it is, and what we can do to change it. And then after that, we read a few other classic texts by Marx that, including the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, including his writing on the Paris Commune, a little bit of Capital to understand commodity fetishism and the accumulation of capital. We also read Engels on socialism, utopian and scientific, and the origins of the family, private property, and the state. These kinds of classic texts, which I think really have become foundational for the Marxist analysis of the world and for the socialist movements in the past 150 years. And I think that they are still useful to read today for exactly the purpose that I laid out of the reading group, to understand how the world works, why history proceeded as it did, how it is set up, how society works, and what hope we have to change it. So I think that what is important about Marxism as a body of theory and Marx's intervention into how we understand the world is that we begin with his materialist analysis of history and of society, meaning that rather than saying what matters is our ideas about the world, or what matters is what we think about religion or God, the church, we have to begin with the production of the world around us, the material world, the material goods that we need as humans in order to survive, that we labor to produce. And Marx says in the Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts of 1844 that it is what makes us human, what defines us as human rather than just animals in the world, is that we produce the world around us. We produce the conditions for our own life and society. So we don't just encounter food and shelter out in the world, but rather we organize together to produce these things, to produce what we need, and then we share it amongst ourselves in order to live. But then what happens is that our labor, the material goods that we produce, are taken from us by this person who we call the capitalist, right? By the boss. And that this person who takes our labor, who takes the surplus value that we produce, this person has taken many forms throughout history. But it all comes down to the fact that we, the many, want to produce the world around us, want to produce the goods that we need, want to self-organize ourselves and live good lives. But instead, what we produce is taken from us. And under capitalism, it is taken by the capitalist class who owns the means of production. The only way that we can survive is to work in the factories that the capitalists own because they stole the land from us and they stole our ability to reproduce our own lives. And so our ability to produce ourselves as humans and produce the material world around us that Marx thinks is what actually makes us human is taken from us, is seized by the capitalist, and the capitalist decides what happens to it, decides what happens to this material reality. And at the same time, our political capacities to organize our own lives beyond simple economic production is also taken from us and alienated into higher bodies, typically what we think of as the state, right? The capitalist state, where politics as such is seen to happen. So our production of the material world around us and our production of what we want to see in terms of social organization and our ability to make decisions about the things that affect us are all taken away from us and seized by the capitalist class and by the state. And this produces a terrible situation of great anxiety, of frustration, and also great poverty and miseration. And this has happened across the world because of colonialism, imperialism, that capitalism is so tied up in, of seizing land and seizing the means of production from people and centralizing it into the hands of the capitalists and the state. But Marx and Engels say there is a silver lining to all of this, and that is that the capitalist class, in doing this, produces its own grave diggers. By centralizing the means of production into factories and forcing people off of the land and into the factories in order to work, capitalists have, in effect, already socialized production. That the only way that we can produce the goods that we need is to come together and do it collectively. But the problem now is that we're collectively producing the world together as the working class, but still the capitalists are taking the surplus value that we produce and they're determining how the world works. Yeah. And so what we need to do is to recognize the power that comes from the fact that we have been concentrated, that we collectively labor, and to work together to recognize the power that we have and to build power and to take back power from the capitalist class and to build a real democracy from the bottom up of both economic democracy, so controlling our own workplaces, and also social democracy to democratically determine what our neighborhoods look like, what our towns look like, what the world looks like, so that we are able to make the decisions about things that affect us and put our own lives and our own values over the profit of the few. I know that that was a long answer to your question, but these are the kinds of things that we're trying to tease out as we went back to these old dead white men, right, of the 19th centuries, that I think that they really offer a lot in terms of thinking through these questions and giving us a framework for what it would take to change this system that controls our lives and actually take back power for ourselves.
I think I now see maybe why I was less interested in Marx as a young person, because from the 1930s through the 1970s, the face of capitalism was considerably changing in this country. And there actually was also at least a beginning of some redistribution of goods and services back to the broad people, whether or not they were working in factories. And more recently, there has been a severe turning back from that. And we are actually getting into a much more classical kind of capitalism these days. And that, again, makes Marx seem more relevant to the present than it did, let's say, to the late 1970s. Although you talked about people having nothing to do but work in factories, and yet I think you would hear, you're smiling, you would hear a lot of Americans these days say, but we want to work in factories. We wish we could work in factories. They've taken away the factories. They've sent them to Mexico, to China, to Vietnam, to Bangladesh. Globalization is a variant on colonialism. And part of it seems to be to export the opportunity, hellacious as it is, to labor in the factories to other places. But getting back to your reading group, after reading the classics, I don't know, for a couple of years, maybe even a year or so, you seem to have gone on to read some newer books that are by Marxists, but not the old ones. So perhaps, again, you could tell us about some of the things you've been reading.
I mean, just really quickly to what you just laid out, I think that it's important to think of capitalism as having always been a global system, right? As always functioning at a world scale rather than just, what we sometimes think of as, oh, it started in England in the factories 200 years ago. But the fact is that the factories producing textiles were doing it with cotton from slave labor in the Americas. And so that, we can always think of capitalism as a world system, and that capitalists as a transnational global class are always trying to extract the most profit from the system in any way that they can. And they decided as a class in around the 1970s that they could extract more profit by moving factories to the so-called third world rather than the first, so-called first world, for a variety of reasons, one of which was the union strength and, social democracy that had been built in the US and Europe. And so the capitalists realized that they could make more profit elsewhere. And so I think that this is also why we need to think in terms of global solidarity, of what it means to unite workers in all parts of the world against our common enemy of the capitalist class. And I think that, some of what we read in the reading group since the early days of reading Marx and Engels is addressing some of these questions. Because we move from Marx and Engels and kind of their classic analysis of capitalism, of how it works, to thinking more about strategy. Given this analysis of capitalism, given our analysis of it dividing us into different classes, defined by our relationship to the means of production and our relationship to each other, what then are we to do? Or as Lenin would put it, what is to be done? So our second unit was on what is to be done, and we read Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg. And we went into a lot of the Marxist analysis of the state and the Marxist analysis of what it means to build a revolutionary party and build power and to eventually seize the states and try to build this thing that we call socialism with the states. And so we read Lenin's The State and Revolution, we read part of What Is to Be Done, we read Rosa Luxemburg's some of her critiques of Lenin, we read her The Mass Strike and Reform or Revolution. And all of this was to sort of begin a much broader conversation about revolutionary strategy that then we wanted to bring back to DSA. After that, we did a sort of mini unit on socialist strategy beyond Lenin and Luxemburg, where we read Trotsky, Gramsci, and Mao, to try to get some very different ideas of where do we go from here? Where do we go with this idea of the vanguard party? Where do we go with the mass working class party? And what do we have to learn from this for our own activism in Ithaca today? So say reading Mao on the mass line, where he talks about how the party needs to have a certain kind of relationship with the people, right? That it's from the masses to the masses, that the party has a certain kind of idea of how the world works that is informed by Marxism, Leninism, right? But the party does not necessarily know what is actually going on in the world, what is actually going on with people's lives. And so it has to go, quote, to the masses, ask people what is going on in their lives, ask people what kinds of problems they're facing, and then collectively work together to develop solutions to those problems that are informed by the Marxist analysis of capitalism and of revolutionary struggle. Now, none of this is to say that I agree with all of these thinkers on various things, right? And we can talk about, I'm coming from, as you know, more of an anarchist perspective, where I have a very strong critique of using the state as a tool of building socialism and of liberating ourselves, and a critique of the vanguard party. But this is also things that we talked about in the reading group, right? Of different interpretations of Marx and Lenin and Mao and so on. But after that, we sort of left behind for a moment the classic, great leaders of Marxism, and we decided to do a series of mini units that were more directly related to our own work in Ithaca. And so DSA a year ago decided to focus on a single priority campaign for this year, which, as we know, is the struggle to make public transportation in Ithaca free and expanded. So take the TCAT, the Tompkins Area Transit, what's it called? Area Transit, and make
Area
it free
Consolidated.
Yes.
Consolidated Area Transit. That's the CAT.
There we go. But so we wanted, the campaign is to expand public transportation and make it free. And so we wanted to have an analysis of what does this mean from an eco-socialist perspective? Because part of the campaign is framed around environmentalism, right? Of reducing dependence on cars and making buses easier to access, more widespread, etc., as part of a strategy to try to save the planet from destruction. So we did a mini unit on eco-socialism to try to figure out what the Marxist tradition has to offer to our thinking on ecological questions, to our thinking on organizing for uh, environmental campaigns today. So we read some John Bellamy Foster, who's a sort of leading theorist of Marx and ecology. We also read some Murray Bookchin talking about social ecology. And we read the Red Nations, The Red Deal, which was talking about it all from an indigenous revolutionary perspective. And so those conversations really directly led into a lot of the activism that the Eco-Socialist Working Group was doing and that the broader Priority Campaign was doing. Similarly, after that, we did a unit on rank and file labor organizing, where we, amongst other things, read some Jane McAlevey and talked about labor notes and read some Kim Moody and thinking through these questions of how do we organize effectively as the working class in Ithaca to build working class power and to make our lives better as workers? And then how does that relate to expanding public transit? And how does that relate to building radical democracy from the ground up in Ithaca and to transforming our lives? And then when the Supreme Court ruled overturned Roe v. Wade, we decided to do a unit on Marxist feminism because the question of reproductive freedom and of this attack on women and on queer people became very central to what was going on in the world. And so we wanted to understand what was going on, what was happening, and what it would mean to actually take on this beast that we call patriarchy as a system of male dominance of society that goes far beyond sort of interpersonal sexism, and figure out how that fits in with our class analysis and our analysis of the environment and how that fits in with our analysis of the history of capitalism and colonialism. And then finally, right now, we're doing a mini unit on Black radicalism and anti-colonial Marxism, and we're reading Robin D.G. Kelly's book, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, which is an absolutely incredible book that sort of traces some of the broad contours of the Black radical imagination that how Black people in the United States have dealt with the, terrible realities of oppression and exploitation that they have faced in the history of the United States and around the world, and how they have produced new theory and analysis and also incredible arts and culture and radical forms of organization and radical forms of social relations. And so how does that fit in with the Marx of 1848? And so these are the conversations that we're having in the Marxist reading group, and we're using, short bits of many different kinds of texts and trying to put them together into some sort of synthesis that we can then apply to our work in Ithaca.
And, well, I was going to ask you something so do you consider yourself a Marxist? You said you consider yourself an anarchist. What's the relationship between the two?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something that I'm still working through on a personal level. I'll answer that by actually referring to an interview that I conducted about a year ago with an older activist named John Garvey, who's been around for a long time in Brooklyn. He helped organize a taxi drivers union in the 1970s. He's connected with the Sojourner Truth Organization, which was an organization of communists in the 60s through 80s that went into the factories in the 1970s to try to organize the working class as good Marxist-Leninists. And then they were kind of confronted with the changes brought about by deindustrialization, globalization, the end of the movements of the 60s, the Reagan counter-revolution, that destroyed so much of the radical hope of the 60s, and it forced them to sort of reckon with the politics of Marxism and Leninism and to try to come up with something new. And so when I asked John Garvey the question of how did he identify politically now and what he saw as the relationship between Marxism and anarchism, he said that he thought that they had a lot to offer to each other and a lot to learn from each other, right? And so that anarchists could benefit so much from the kind of rigorous, serious study of social problems, and the framework that Marxism presents as a sort of coherent understanding of the world that leads to a serious strategy for how to change the world, that anarchists often lack, or it's some eclectic cobbled together mix of wanting personal liberation and a new way of living. So anarchists can really benefit from a study of Marx and Marxism to kind of counteract some of the individualist and lifestyle focused tendencies of the anarchist tradition. And I think he's totally right there. But then he said that Marxists have a lot to learn from anarchists as well, particularly the anarchist critique of the state. Because in the Marxist tradition, the state is analyzed at the bottom as a mechanism of class rule of society, right? That the ruling class controls the state and uses it as a tool to enforce its dominance and to sort of help along the process of extracting value from the masses, right? So under capitalism, the capitalist ruling class controls the state and uses it to keep down the proletariat, to use the police to break up unions, etc. But if a class controls the state, that means that a new class could potentially control the state. So a lot of Marxists believe in the possibility of what they call a proletarian dictatorship, right? Of building a working class state that could use the mechanisms of the state in order to suppress capitalism and to build socialism. But anarchists say, no, the state cannot be used as a tool for liberation, right? There might be some good things that could come from the state, and looking at, the history of revolutionary traditions and also of social democracy, right? I would love to have universal health care provided by the state, right? But I think if we're thinking about liberation, and if we're thinking about, totally transforming our society and totally transforming how we relate to each other, that the state cannot be the tool for that, because the state at root is the ossified alienation of our own power to create the world around us, and putting that power into the hands of a few people as representatives, quote unquote representatives, to try to do something with it.
Well,
and that what we need instead is to build power at the grassroots, to build democracy from the bottom up and take back control of our own lives. And so I think Marxism and anarchism have a lot to offer to each other in that sense.
Well, that's exciting. If somebody wants to get in touch.
Yeah, go to the Ithaca DSA website. Yeah, come join us at the Marxist Reading Group. Talk about these things.
IthacaDSA.org. Thank you, Spencer Beswick. This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.